In 1966, a movie was released with a gorilla suit so cheap that you could see the zipper in nearly every single shot. The director didn't care. The actors didn't care. And somehow, decades later, people are still watching it. Not ironically, not as a joke. They genuinely cannot turn it off. And that film isn't even the wildest entry on this list, because here's what nobody tells you about the 1960s. While critics were busy celebrating the French New Wave and debating the genius of Kubrick, an entire parallel universe of cinema was thriving in the margins. Movies made for almost nothing, shot in garages and deserts and borrowed swimming pools, starring people who had no business being on screen but brought something that big-budget Hollywood couldn't fake: energy. Reckless, unhinged, completely sincere energy. And one of the films we're going to talk about today was so bizarre that a famous television show built an entire episode around mocking it, only for the movie itself to become more popular than that parody. We'll get there. The Creeping Terror, 1964. Picture this: a monster that looks like a shag carpet draped over a parade float slowly, and I mean slowly, devours people who just sort of walk into its mouth. That's The Creeping Terror. The film allegedly lost most of its original audio, so enormous stretches are covered by a monotone narrator explaining what the characters are feeling instead of letting them speak. The result is one of the most accidentally hypnotic viewing experiences of the decade. You keep watching because your brain cannot reconcile what it's seeing with the fact that someone finished this and said, "Yes, release it." It belongs here because it represents the absolute floor of 1960s filmmaking, while somehow remaining completely watchable. The lesson is simple. If your movie breaks every rule of cinema, but people still can't look away, you've accidentally discovered something most directors spend careers chasing. And the next entry proves that a bigger budget doesn't mean a better monster. The Giant Gila Monster, 1959, released widely in 1960s television rotation. Technically a late 50s production, but this one became a 1960s staple through constant television airplay, and that's where most people encountered it. The Gila Monster is a real lizard filmed on miniature sets and composited into scenes with actors who are clearly nowhere near it. The hero is a hot-rodding teenager who sings, fixes cars, and eventually saves his town by driving a nitro-loaded jalopy into the beast. It's ridiculous. The pacing drags in places, the science is non-existent, and the miniature work is charmingly obvious. But there's an earnestness to the whole production that hooks you. It earns its spot because the gap between its ambition and its resources is a masterclass in unintentional comedy. The takeaway? Audiences will forgive almost anything if the hero is likable and the ending involves an explosion. But what happens when a movie doesn't even have a likable hero, or a coherent plot, or honestly, a reason to exist? Monster A Go-Go, 1965. This might be the most bewildering film on the entire list. It started as an unfinished movie by one director, was purchased and sort of completed by another, and the two halves don't match. Characters appear and disappear without explanation. Monster, an irradiated astronaut, is barely shown, and the ending, without giving it away, essentially tells the audience that nothing they just watched actually happened. It's infamous for a reason. Monster A Go-Go is here because it's the rare film that feels like it's actively fighting against being a movie. And the lesson is that sometimes the most memorable thing a film can do is leave audiences staring at the screen in complete confusion, because they'll talk about that confusion for decades. Now here's where things start getting genuinely strange. The Astro Zombies, 1968. Ted V. Mikels directed this masterpiece of confusion, starring John Carradine as a scientist creating solar-powered zombie assassins using parts from corpses. The plot involves the CIA, a foreign spy ring, and a love interest who exists purely to be kidnapped. Carradine, a classically trained actor who appeared in hundreds of films, delivers every line as if he's performing King Lear, and the dissonance between his gravitas and the cardboard sets around him is the purest distillation of everything this list celebrates. There's a scene where a zombie walks around holding a flashlight to its own forehead because it needs light to function, and it goes on for an almost confrontational amount of time. The Astro Zombies earns the #1 spot, because it has everything. A great actor slumming magnificently, a premise that makes no sense, technical failures in every department, and a quality of entertainment that expensive, polished films would kill for. The final lesson is this: the movies we can't stop watching aren't always the ones that got everything right. Sometimes they're the ones that got everything wrong in exactly the right way. The Beast of Yucca Flats, 1961. Directed by Coleman Francis, starring the legendary Tor Johnson, and filmed without synchronous sound, meaning almost nothing you hear matches what's on screen. Tor Johnson plays a Soviet scientist who wanders into a nuclear test site, becomes irradiated, and stumbles around the desert strangling people. The narration is delivered in bizarre, poetic non-sequiturs. Flag on the moon. How did it get there? That line has nothing to do with anything in the movie, and it's become one of the most quoted lines in bad movie history. It's on this list because it proves a film can be only an hour long, mostly silent and almost plotless, and still burn itself into your memory forever. The lesson is that atmosphere, even accidentally created atmosphere, is more powerful than plot. And if you think atmosphere can't carry a movie, the next one is about to challenge that idea in the most uncomfortable way possible. Manos, The Hands of Fate, 1966. Here it is, arguably the most famous so bad it's good movie of the 1960s, and some would say of all time. Made by a fertilizer salesman named Harold P. Warren on a bet, Manos follows a family who stumbles upon a cult, led by a figure called the Master and his servant Torgo, who has enormous unexplained knees. The camera could only shoot about 30 seconds of footage at a time, so scenes cut abruptly and constantly. The audio is dubbed by what sounds like 3 people doing every voice, and there are driving sequences that seem to last geological ages. It gained mainstream notoriety after a popular television show devoted to mocking bad movies featured it, and the parody made the original even more beloved. This is the open loop I promised you earlier. The show's treatment made Manos more popular than anyone could have predicted, turning a forgotten regional curiosity into a permanent fixture of cult cinema. It's here because it represents the absolute pinnacle of ambition outpacing ability and creating something immortal in the process. The lesson is the most important one on this list. Passion without skill can still produce something the world never forgets. Shoo, if you're enjoying this deep dive into 1960s disaster cinema and you want a part 2, drop a comment and tell me which decade or genre to autopsy next. Plan 9 from Outer Space, 1957, but a 1960s cult staple. Like the giant Gila monster, Plan 9 technically predates the 60s, but became an absolute icon during that decade through television broadcasts and midnight screenings. Ed Wood's magnum opus features aliens resurrecting the dead to stop humanity from building a doomsday weapon. Bela Lugosi, who passed away during pre-production, appears in brief footage that Wood repurposed, replacing him for remaining scenes with a chiropractor who held a cape over his face. The flying saucers are clearly on strings. The dialogue is legendary in its awkwardness. And yet, there's a genuine sweetness to Ed Wood's filmmaking that makes you root for him, even as every scene falls apart. It belongs here because it's the film that essentially invented the so bad it's good category for mainstream audiences. The lesson? Sincerity is the secret ingredient. Audiences can tell when a filmmaker genuinely loved what they were making, even when the result is objectively terrible. Now let's talk about what happens when the failure isn't sweet at all, when it's loud, aggressive, and completely unhinged. Eegah, 1962. Richard Kiel, years before he'd become famous as a Bond villain, plays a prehistoric caveman discovered in the California desert. A teenage girl and her boyfriend encounter him, and things get weird fast. The pacing is erratic, the romantic subplot is uncomfortable by any era's standards, and there are extended scenes of dune buggy riding that serve no purpose. Arch Hall Jr., the lead actor, also performs several musical numbers that stop the movie cold. And the caveman's reintegration into modern society is handled with all the nuance of a sledgehammer. Eegah is on this list because it's a movie that gets more baffling the longer you watch it, which is exactly why you can't stop. The lesson is that casting someone physically imposing in a role that requires vulnerability creates a tension that's fascinating even when it's unintentional. And speaking of unintentional tension, the next entry takes that concept to an entirely different planet. Santa Claus Conquers the Martians, 1964. Martian children are depressed because they don't have Santa Claus. So the Martians kidnap Santa from Earth. That's the plot. That's really the plot. The costumes look like they were assembled from a hardware store. Child actors deliver their lines with a mixture of terror and confusion that may not have been entirely performative. And there's a character named Dropo who is essentially the Martian equivalent of comic relief, except nothing he does is funny, which somehow makes it funnier. This film has become a holiday staple in certain circles, aired and screened every December by people who love it with their whole hearts. It's here because it proves that a completely absurd premise, executed with total sincerity, becomes a kind of outsider art. The takeaway is that holiday movies don't need quality, they need tradition, and this one has earned that. Let's pause and notice something. We're halfway through, and a clear pattern has emerged. The movies that endure in the So Bad It's Good Hall of Fame aren't the ones that are cynical or lazy. They're the ones made by people who genuinely tried and spectacularly missed. That gap between intention and result is where the magic lives. The Horror of Party Beach, 1964. Billed as the first horror monster musical, this film combines radioactive sea creatures with beach party dance sequences and folk rock performances. The monsters look like someone glued sausages to a wetsuit. The plot involves toxic waste, creating gill men who attack teenagers. And the musical numbers, while catchy in a low-rent surf rock way, have absolutely nothing to do with the horror elements. It's two genres smashed together with no regard for tone, logic, or audience expectations. It's here because it represents the 1960s tendency to combine whatever was popular into one product, regardless of whether those things belong together. The lesson is that genre mashups only work if someone is steering the ship, and in this case, no one was even on the ship. Because the next entry didn't just lack a captain, it lacked an entire crew. The Skydivers, 1963. Another Coleman Francis production, and somehow even more baffling than Beast of Yucca Flats. The plot involves a skydiving school, a love triangle, and a murder committed by pouring acid on a parachute. But the actual runtime is mostly filled with people drinking coffee, sitting in rooms, and watching skydiving footage that goes on for minutes at a time without any narrative purpose. The acting is flat in a way that feels almost experimental, as if everyone on screen has been mildly sedated. It belongs here because it's the ultimate test of so bad it's good endurance. If you can find entertainment in the Skydivers, you can find entertainment in anything. The lesson is that pacing is the most underrated element of filmmaking because when it's absent, you notice nothing else. The incredibly strange creatures who stopped living and became mixed-up zombies, 1964. Yes, that's the real title. Often cited as one of the longest movie titles in history, this Ray Dennis Steckler film is a psychedelic carnival nightmare involving hypnotism, musical numbers, and zombie attacks. Steckler cast himself in the lead under a pseudonym, and the result is a fever dream that feels like 3 different movies were edited together by someone who'd never seen a movie. The carnival scenes have a genuinely unsettling quality that undercuts the film's campy reputation. It's on this list because its title alone is a work of outsider art, and the film somehow lives up to that title's chaotic promise. The takeaway? Sometimes the most honest thing a movie can do is warn you in its title exactly how unhinged it's going to be. Bride of the Monster, 1955, 1960s cult circuit fixture. Ed Wood returns. Bela Lugosi gives what many consider his most committed late-career performance as a mad scientist with a giant octopus. The octopus prop famously didn't work, so actors had to manually wrap its tentacles around themselves and thrash. Lugosi, despite clearly declining health, delivers his monologues with Shakespearean intensity. And that contrast between his seriousness and the production's cheapness creates something genuinely moving. It's here because it's the rare, so bad it's good movie that also contains a legitimately great performance trapped inside a terrible film. The lesson hits hard. Talent doesn't disappear just because the project around it collapses. Sometimes it shines brighter. They Saved Hitler's Brain, 1968. This is the movie where a director cast himself as hero, villain, and narrator. Actually, the production history is even wilder than that. The original film was shot in the early 1960s, then additional footage was shot years later with completely different actors, film stock, and lighting to pad it to feature length. The two halves don't match at all. You can literally see the decade change between scenes. The premise involves Nazis preserving Hitler's living head in a jar and smuggling it to South America. The head occasionally gives orders. It's played completely straight. They Saved Hitler's Brain is on this list because it's the single best example of a production so troubled that the final product becomes a document of its own making. And that documentary is more entertaining than any version of the movie could have been. Lesson? When your production falls apart, the wreckage sometimes tells a better story than your script ever did. And now, the one that earns the top spot. One I'd argue is the most rewatchable, so bad it's good movie the 1960s ever produced. And honestly, for entertainment value, they weren't entirely wrong. And that's what the 1960s understood better than any other decade. That cinema doesn't have to be perfect to be unforgettable. It just has to be alive. And every single one of these 15 films, for all their flaws, for all their visible zippers and rubber monsters and incomprehensible plots, is more alive than half the slick, forgettable content released in any given year. If this list proved anything, it's that the line between terrible and legendary is thinner than anyone wants to admit. Now, if you love this, here's what I think you need next. A deep dive into the 1970s, when the students of these exact filmmakers took their lessons, tripled the budgets, and created an entire generation of exploitation cinema that Hollywood is still remaking today. That video is coming, and trust me, the 70s made the 60s look restrained.